Hello, everyone. I know we're getting settled and people are still jumping in, but I'm Heather Clancy. I just want to introduce myself, and I'll probably do that again in a moment because I see the numbers ticking up of people who are coming into our room here. But I'm the editorial director at GreenBiz. I'll be moderating this session on smart connected buildings, and we're going to be speaking about how in an all-electric future, how a building really needs to be participating in helping balance demands on the electric grid, why they cannot be passive consumers of energy, that why there needs to be a two-way interchange of information. So we're going to talk about how buildings can be a resource, as well as how they set the foundation for an electrification strategy through applications such as energy efficiency, automated demand response, and so forth. Before we get right into it, I would like to, in addition to telling us where you're from, if you could put in the chat who you are, what kind of role you play in this conversation. Are you an energy manager? Are you a facilities manager? Is your company small or large? Any information you can give us about your role and your concerns would be great. That we can use the chat for that. I'm going to introduce myself again, just because we've had quite a few people come in. I'm Heather Clancy, the editorial director of GreenBiz, and I will be moderating this discussion. And I also just want to point out that I think one of the important themes you'll hear about is why you don't have to be a huge company to do this. Why, even if you're leasing space in a building, why this is a thing that you can grab onto and benefit from. So with that set up, I'm going to introduce our speakers today just briefly. I'm going to let them give a little more context about their company and their role in response to the first question. But we have Mark Danzenbaker, the CEO of GridPoint. Give us a wave. Christie Dodge, Director of Partner Success for LEAP. And Dave Hughes, the Senior Director of Facilities, Energy, and Smart Buildings for Walgreens. A great panel to discuss this really important session. So with that, I'm going to dive into our first sort of introductory question, which is just why is smart building technology essential and foundational for an electrification strategy in the first place? I'd like to start with Mark.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm Mark Danzenbaker. I'm the CEO of GridPoint. Heather, thank you for having me and Christie and Dave on the panel today. I appreciate it. I think, to answer that question about why it's essential and why it's foundational, I guess I'd start by maybe making a statement that may be obvious, but electrification, the trend of electrification means more demand for energy. And that also collides with the need to also decarbonize that energy supply as much as possible. And doing both changes the fundamental power curve on both the supply and demand side at the same time. And as you do that, you can impact reliability, you can impact energy prices. And so our view is that making the energy transition and electrification requires this sort of future state. And this future state is really two-way. It's interactive, if I can use that term. It's networked, it's decarbonized, and there's this relationship between the producers of energy, the consumers of energy. And that really, at the end of the line, means making every building, both big and small, smart, efficient, sustainable, interactive. And it's all really interrelated. And our view is that you can't make the drive to electrification or the energy transition without virtual power, without tackling buildings at the edge of the grid and making them smart. And it's all tied together, is the short answer.
Great. Christie, your perspective on this question.
Yeah, hi all. Christie Dodge here. I am the head of partner success at LEAP. And LEAP is just a quick one sentence. LEAP's software platform enables smart buildings and other flexible energy resources to actually participate in energy markets and support the grid in times of stress. So this panel topic is particularly near and dear to my heart, having worked on these issues for many years. When it comes to electrification, I mean, like Mark said, buildings, it's kind of there's a challenge and an opportunity. Smart building technologies can turn what is a challenge, that buildings are using more and more energy, into a solution if we think about how we can make that building smart enough to reduce its demand at really critical times. And buildings are already, one of the largest consumers of energy. So it's really critical to tackle the building infrastructure. I think by lowering demand for electricity at critical times, buildings can become this flexible resource that help grid operators and the electricity systems avoid the need to fire up more polluting power plants. So there's that environmental benefit. And there can also be a real revenue benefit too, which we'll get into talking about.
Great. Dave, you live this in your job. So how are you thinking about this smart technologies around Walgreens buildings as a foundation for eventually an electrification strategy?
Yeah. So, by definition, I appreciate the time and the audience here. As you shared, my team watches over all 9,000 Walgreens buildings across the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So by definition, we are deep into the electrification game. Where smart buildings is critical to us is, we're all living and breathing it, honestly, right now, live with the heat waves happening across the country, heat and more so humidity. So we have found everybody's been doing energy efficiency for a very long time. We all understand that. We get it. Some of the technologies have fairly matured out. The next wave of opportunity for us to both balance what's right for all of our budgets and for the carbon output happening in our communities, while also maintaining a healthy operational environment, to me, is only through smart technology. We would all love to do energy efficiency retrofits and set it and forget about it, but that's not the reality, especially when you move past 10, 50, 100, and up into the thousands of locations that my team has to manage. We need systems. We are a partner with GridPoint out there, and we need their systems to both help us monitor and then push out very agile dynamic controls over, how the building is operating and feeling. And again, I've referenced the heat and humidity waves. It's becoming much more intensive and much more sporadic on which area of the country it's going to hit. So when you're managing a fleet this size, we are doing the right thing from an electrification strategy and a decarbonization to take out that consumption where we don't need it. And we're actually doing so well there that now I'm focused on, as we pivot to become more of a healthcare company, where can I refuel some of that back into the stores as we become more of, call it a clinic-based strategy here, where you actually need a different operating environment from a standard retailer. So it's very critical to us. We are well down the path with this. And it is the future for us because, again, we've been doing energy efficiency for years. This is the next wave of how we're going to manage this strategy moving forward.
Right. So we're talking about smart building technology. What exactly are we talking about? What are the technologies here? I've been covering this for a long time, Mark. What's different now? Why is this more possible now? What's coming into place? And anyone can jump on this as well after he's finished.
Yeah, that's great. I'll give a run. I'll give a run at it, and then Dave and Christie can add on as well. I'd start. What's different. And I'd say we're really at a tipping point. I think where the needs of business, Dave, and the need and the priorities from the grid perspective are really converging. And you're seeing rising costs. You're seeing mandates. You're seeing more prevalent disruptions. You're seeing the impact of climate change. All these things are putting technology as a means to make these buildings smart, efficient, interactive, et cetera, all the things that we're saying, at the top of the agenda for customers like Dave, and many like them. I might also, add that I think that, we're at a point where, the industry may have been held back a little bit. And I think I'd probably highlight maybe three things that I think have kind of held us back. I think one is, historically to do, efficiency and other sort of measures within a building and to make it smart, it required a lot of capital. But what you're seeing is a trend towards more as a service models that make it, really easy for customers like Dave and others to pick it up and move forward aggressively. I think the second thing I'd say is that, traditionally there's been a sort of a focus on one asset at a time, not necessarily a cohesive, look at all assets within the building, or as some like to see, all distributed energy resources, or, all the different types of assets that consume energy for Dave today, the HVAC, the lighting, the refrigeration, but also, thinking about the future, the assets of the future, which are going to be, EV charging related or energy storage related. That's where this is going. And you need to be thinking about all the assets together. And I think historically there hasn't been that sort of multi-asset approach. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that I think, we need to think this holistically. I mentioned that it's all interrelated. So we have to think about not just the edge of the grid in the building, but we also have to think about that in the context of the entire grid. So thinking about efficiency and smart buildings, but also in the context of grid services all at the same time. And that's where technology can come in and play a role. Cloud-based, hardware-enabled, service-based, tied in together, make it easy for the customer to pick it up, but also tackle multiple problems at once, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to add on to that, Dave?
Yeah, so Mark picked on a couple themes there, mentioned a couple themes that are very near and dear to my heart. So to me, what's really different today than 10, 15 years ago when a lot of us started down this energy management, decarbonization path that we're on, it's the cloud technology and it's the software and everything we can do with it. The hardware has been out there, whether it's an LED retrofit, whether it's a more efficient HVAC, whether it's a controller system like Mark and his company offer for companies like mine. But I sit in a very fortunate position that I enjoy very much, where I not only watch over the energy program for us, but the facilities management and everything to manage the building. So there's been so much innovation over the past 10 years, let's call it, and especially the last 5, on facilities management software and platforms, really taking it to the next level. Temperature monitoring systems getting out there, everybody inventorying their assets and other store information, and now bringing that together either within a vendor platform or a generic cloud structure. And we can now wrap 360-degree views around this information. And really, again, not only for me is it electrification, decarbonization, but balancing that with the quality of the environment. And I can get a full view on how, or starting to at least, how is this building really operating, that I can go out and harvest some more savings for our ESG goals that are so critically important, while still not sacrificing that customer patient perspective for us. So to me, it's about the cloud and the software and starting to bring everything together here that gives us that real view of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know that you lease most of your buildings. I think the number you gave me was something like 90% or something like that. It was some large number. So how are you teaming up with the real estate owner to do this? I mean, how are you putting this technology into place? The sensor aspects of it, the hardware parts of it.
Yeah, we do have to be sensitive to that to a certain extent. That we have 9,000 locations. We're largely a leased platform, which is different than other organizations I've been with. That puts some constraints on you. Within the box, we can usually do what we need to do. But as Mark and his company are also out there getting into EVs, getting into storage, fuel cell technology like that, that's not available to the footprint that I manage. And even if it was, I would then have to work through hundreds and hundreds of landlord negotiations in order to figure out what we want to do there. So It is a very unique platform, and especially in retail right now, almost all companies are living through the wave that the big boom years were 2000 to 2010. All of those original leases, while retail really exploded across the country, are coming due. So anybody who has a large lease concentration, it's not only what you can and can't do in your box that may create some headwinds, but it's also your company may be looking at, hey, I want to go from this corner to that corner, and I want the flexibility. So we may have all the opportunities in the world, but we have to think through that before we can pull the trigger on the decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to go over to Christie now. And there's a question I'm going to probably ask you after you talk about data, the role of data in these solutions, because it is about the information we're getting. So, what sources are really important, Christie?
Yeah. So Leap is a software provider. And we're a provider of grid services solutions. So in order to do that, we just rely exclusively on data. We utilize data about the customer and the load on site, which we typically get from the site's energy meter in order to demonstrate grid services and performance. So this means we rely heavily on data from the electric utility and then the associated smart meter infrastructure. One challenge that we face in some markets is that there's a real need for grid flexibility, and there's this growth of smart buildings, but that has in some cases outpaced the deployment of smart meter infrastructure. And so that means that data is not easily accessible in a lot of places that don't have advanced metering infrastructure, which means many buildings and other distributed energy resources may not be able to participate in, programs like demand response or other grid services programs if they require smart meter data for participation. So that's, one tension when it comes to the role of data in these services. We rely so heavily on smart meter data and customer data from the utilities, and it's not always there.
How do you get it?
Yeah, good question. We go through a process that we work directly with our partners, so in this case, GridPoint, and GridPoint's end customers to go through kind of an enrollment and authorization process to access that data. LEAP has a solution where we actually have kind of an online process and flow that allows end customers to go through their utility to authorize LEAP as their grid services provider, and that's how we get access to that data.
Mm-hmm. Mark, it looks like you want to say something. Jump in.
Oh, I was just, going to say that when we kicked this off and we had our pre-meeting, I told you, Dave's my favorite customer and Christie's my favorite partner. So I was excited when she mentioned, working with, we all work closely together, and Christie's absolutely right. We're able to bring technology to Dave by working closely together.
Right. So one of the things that we came up just a moment ago was demand response. By the way, let me just pause for a moment and just say to the folks in the audience that if you want to ask a question, you can pop it into the Q&A tab or into the chat. We'll try to pick it up in the chat. It's probably better to put it in the Q&A tab so we can see it. But I want to ask sort of get the topic of demand response out there a little bit more so we can debate and talk about that. Because it's certainly not a new concept, but we're in a climate change world. How are services changing? We've got frequent grid events, blackouts, rolling blackouts. I'm here. We're all on the East Coast. It's been super hot. Like, how is the world of demand response changing, especially in this climate changed world, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start, and I know Christie will have some things to add as well. I think maybe the first thing I'd say is we tend to use the term grid services to mean a broader sort of quantum of sort of opportunities that include some traditional demand response programs, but some others. And I think Christie will likely touch on maybe a bit of the sort of explosion and sort of types of assets, types of programs, more real-time programs, and how that's moved. I would just, before she does that, I would probably make a couple comments. Like, first, I think that some of the traditional grid services programs have tended to overlook smaller buildings, which is not to say they aren't a great potential resource, but to say that they're smaller. So you have to kind of do this in a really cost-effective way, which we do by trying to sort of value stack multiple things to an end customer like Dave. Don't just focus on the demand response. Try and help him achieve all his objectives. And one of those things in this recipe is to enable grid services within his locations in a way that works for Dave. And maybe I'll try, and Dave will nod his head if he agrees with me, that there's some customer perspectives here. And I think a lot of the customers I talk to, they're worried about a few things. I think one thing they're worried about is the inflationary impacts of energy costs having a negative impact on the P&L. What's that going to do to me at my stores, at all my stores, at lots of stores, and globally for the whole P&L? Second, just operational reliability, in the face of a changing power curve, and making sure that we can have the doors open and the business humming when we need to. That's what reliability is all about. Reliability in the grid context means having the doors open and having business continuity from the end customer's perspective. So I think that's the second thing, just straight up operational reliability. And the third thing I'd say is just the need for constant eyes and ears at their sites, and knowing across all the assets, not just one class of assets, but all the assets within the facility, across the facilities, in locations, in response to events that could be grid related or could be just weather related, right? Things happen. We have to respond and make sure that customers are comfortable, employees are comfortable, that the business is operating, and really help this sort of larger need from the customer. Energy is important, the transition's happening, but at the end of the day, we got we're talking about businesses that need to have the doors open and make the trains run on time.
Christie, talk to us a little bit more about how demand response could benefit a smaller mid-sized company. Like walk us through a day in the life of how this works. And I'm going to come to Dave for a similar question in a moment.
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what Mark said. And demand response has really, as a concept and a revenue opportunity, evolved a lot over the last decade or so. Before it was a building operator gets a phone call to reduce their demand on site for a 5-hour period. And then a building operator's there manually flipping switches when the grid's experiencing, a time of stress. Nowadays, demand response has evolved to be more smart and more automated. And there's a growing number of ways. Mark said value stacking. There's different programs that a building could participate in to provide a service to the grid. So that's what we're calling grid services. And what that means is, buildings that are smart, EV charging stations, batteries, can all be connected to automatically receive grid services signals, and then reduce demand for short or long duration events, depending on like a certain set of operating constraints, time of day, weather, and kind of the needs of the building, or the charging needs for an electric vehicle, or the state of energy for a battery system. And with how fast responding these technologies are, they could provide more than just capacity, more than just a standby resource like a power plant is. They can provide energy. They might also be able to start providing more advanced things like ancillary services, frequency regulation, and spinning reserves. What LEAP does is we're trying to match our partners' resources to the best opportunities to fit the partner and the end customer's goals, and just what their operational needs are. So in the case of GridPoint and Walgreens, what that might look like is LEAP does some kind of quick value analysis to understand what kind of programs or value streams GridPoint and Walgreens can access with their smart building portfolio, depending on what technology is on site and what their other goals are. We go through an enrollment process into specific market programs, and then the participation in we identify what the curtailment ability is. It's not generation we're supplying, but actually demand that we're reducing. And then in California, for example, we're actually bidding GridPoint and Walgreens assets, smart buildings directly into the wholesale energy market, and we're sending along and passing along dispatch signals from the utility or from the market. And then we manage the settlement process with the markets, and we pay our partners. And in this case, GridPoint would manage the financial translation with Walgreens. So that's the very high level kind of picture of what grid services looks like with LEAP today. And we can get into some more examples as we go.
So Dave, how is the value of demand response changing for your organization, for Walgreens, like as the customer, it's evolving?
Yeah, great question. And I think those of us who have been in the business for a while, it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of demand response from being, hey, what is this? To a little bit of participation to, it's a fairly mature and refined program out there. And all of us understand the basis for it, the need, and we all love to participate and give back capacity to the grid to keep it in balance so that, we don't go back to the 2000s and the rolling brownouts and blackouts that were pretty pervasive. I would take it down a different path that the commercial customers who have gotten a little bit further down the path on that, it not only is participation in demand response structured programs, but I really dwell on, think of a state like Texas. This is the third year in a row that we are getting hit with very big price spikes due to the deregulated nature of that market. That is forcing us, even with or without a demand response program out there, to go, hey, for us to not explode a budget here, and also to help the grid and what's happening out there, how can we pull back on some consumption? So it's a much more dynamic marketplace out there for companies that have been fortunate enough to get further down the path here, to really help the communities out, that you're not getting an active signal from a structured program. The market's just telling you, hey, this is going to get real pricey. So, because it's hit us a little bit here over the past 3 years here. So now we're starting to get ahead of these And when we start to see the headlines and really pay attention to that, we get together and we're like, how can we carve some usage out of the equation here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have some questions in the Q&A that I'm going to jump over to just for a moment. I'm going to kind of go back and forth. And this is for anyone. Can you talk more about financing these investments? What are the obstacles and how is the market changing to overcome those obstacles? Are there new approaches to allocating this risk? So anyone want to leap into that first? Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. I find that different customers, have different priorities for how they make capital allocation decisions. In some cases, there's customers that want to deploy capital. In other cases, customers prefer, an OpEx expense. And some of that can vary over time, even within the same customer. What we'd like to do and what we see as a trend, and, not trying to be a GridPoint commercial, but really trying to say like what we think, to advance this industry and to advance this technology and advance the ball here, we think that as a service models that have options that don't require capital from customers up front, sort of like a zero down, everything's included style model under a term that tucks nicely within the lease of that customer's situation and works for them. We find that has done very well. Everything's included: the equipment, the warranty, the software, the services, the participation in grid services, everything with it, and evolving with the customer over time. We find that is, very attractive to most customers. And, for our perspective, a customer wants to, prepay and deploy capital and capitalize it, that's fine too. And I think, providing that kind of flexibility and making it easy and tying it into sort of an all-in sort of style decision based on some packages just makes it easy. Some of this is like, let's not make it too complicated. Let's make it easy for customers to adopt this kind of technology. And I think that's key. I think that's held back some of the industry for a while. And I think creating and furthering these as a service, models with, easy options for customers, it helps things get out there quickly.
I love your thoughts on this, Dave.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, it's actually very customer specific. I think Mark started to get to there that I've got a lot of good friends at other organizations that some of them really love that energy as a service model that Mark and team are really strong at presenting. Some of them really have a bias to, hey, they want to deploy their own capital. But a lot of this is cyclical, and especially in the retail space that I've lived in most of my career, it's hyper competitive, and you always have competing demands for capital. If you want to go down that path, if that's the bias of your company. But where that company is at in its reinvention cycle can put some significant pressures there. In addition to those two ends out there, there's been an entire industry stood up in the energy space of third-party financing, essentially. That if you're not going to go to the model that Mark may offer as one of the options to you, and yet you still can't access the capital, there are third parties that will help you achieve your goals here. So it's been fascinating to watch all these different industries pop up, and actually, especially in this inflationary cycle, energy tends to be a bit of a defensive play for companies. That I see more companies kind of leaning in and go, how can we help here during this cycle?
Okay, great. I have a really specific question for you, Christie. What kinds of smart building technologies does LEAP work with?
Yeah, so LEAP doesn't actually control devices or buildings directly, but instead we're working with our partners' technologies to reduce demand on site. So in this case, we're working with GridPoint's technology that they have deployed in the Walgreens portfolio to actually reduce demand and bid that capacity or energy into the energy markets. So Mark can talk a little bit more about like the technology itself, maybe.
Yeah, sure. And I would just add that, as Dave pointed out, there's, formal programs within utilities or within the market, but then there's also, controlling the site, differently based on the tariff or rate structure for that customer. And you want to be able to do both. Both are important, but differently needed at different points. And if you think about where this may go, and this is a personal view, I think where this will go is we'll see the need to control differently based on not just cost, but also the carbon intensity and the greenness of the electrons that are being produced. I think that's where this will go. And I think, my advice to customers out there would be to make sure you have technology in the building that is able to control the assets and manage the building for when that inevitable day will come, whether that's, it's not going to be tomorrow, it may not be next week, but I believe that's where we're headed.
Coming back to you, Dave, someone's asking, can you talk a little bit more about the issues where and when you can pursue electrification in leased owned locations? Are there locations where landlords are providing leadership there? I also love to, I'm just going to key in on something we talked about in our pre-meeting, which was a little bit more about the MD Live partnership. If I'm butchering the name, I apologize. Village MD, I'm sorry, Village MD. How that sort of module within your stores how you can kind of segment things out. I think that's probably useful as well. So help us understand a little bit more about how it really relates to that electrification strategy.
Got it. So let me try to answer the question in the Q&A here. And if I'm interpreting that correctly, it's around where we may want to pursue electrification, and I'll use the example EV charging stations that then go out into more of a outside the building and even a CAM type space if we are in a large leased facility. So I'd say a lot of the large commercial landlords get it, and they not only want it. For us, we find less headwinds to those conversations because at the end of the day, we're in largely a retail center, and it's all about foot traffic. And the market has really started to open up and things like that, and working with landlords and other partners. And again, maybe it's select ones, but we've seen the explosion of electric vehicles lately here. What were challenging conversations 3, 5, 6 years ago, why would I carve that part of the property out and run all this conduit? Now is hey, how fast can we move on that? So it varies by landlord. It varies by what you're looking at doing outside the box. And what the intent is with there. But there are some, again, there are some large commercial operators out there and some REITs that I know some people pretty well that they are even way more progressive than the companies I've worked for. They're really all over this because, again, they want to provide that service for all the customers in the community to get foot traffic into their centers. If I pivot to, so Village MD is a great discussion here. We're very public about this. It's a partnership that we're doing that the average Walgreens is about 13,000 square feet. And we're carving out, call it about 3,000 square feet within our sites and 1,000 sites over a series of years here to bring in primary care clinics. So these aren't just the minute clinics. These aren't just the quick cough, cold, and flu. These are full primary care clinics, and we're giving them a long-term lease on that space. And then hopefully we get the partnerships of, we have the prescriptions, we have all the other health benefits on our side, and we get some synergies that way besides just the COVID located. Where it gets really interesting, we've been doing a series of these throughout the years. We've had some partnerships with Kroger's that we're public about. We've got LabCorp, which is lab services think about drug testing and that. What it's forcing us to do is Walgreens is having to segment. We need more smart control technology inside the box because each of those different spaces have different operating condition requirements. So running a retail space versus a pharmacy versus a clinic versus a lab services, all of them, largely may operate somewhat the same, but they're going to have very different operating conditions that they demand. And trying to figure out how you can tailor a small 13,000 square foot box to all those different customers it's a challenge, we'll just say. So we're early in our journey where VMD, Village MD, is the big one on our radar now that we're working with day in, day out to see how they can have their own systems and design, to see how we can also co-manage, because there are some stores where maybe they're on their own meter. There are some stores where they're on my meter. So we've got to live in this world together. So it's a fascinating headwind. But again, the more smart technology we have in there and laying the groundwork, the more we can achieve what we want to do together, because they're also out there trying to achieve their sustainability and ESG goals. So.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to come back to some of the Q&A questions in a moment, but I want to go to something that was briefly mentioned a moment ago, which is electric vehicles, right? So we know that a lot of organizations are putting charging stations in their buildings, and this becomes a point of differentiation at a retail location or at a corporate office. So how does this sort of smart building technology help with that? Why is this essential for that kind of strategy? Can we start with you, Mark?
Sure. And I think it could be different for different types of customers. But in many cases, customers they have assets within the box, as they've said. What are we talking about? We're talking about HVAC, lighting, refrigeration, cooking equipment. I could go on and on with all the assets within a typical commercial business. And we see that extending towards other assets of the future. And that's gonna include, and our belief is that ultimately there's going to be energy storage systems, deployed in many of the buildings over time. And that's going to take some time for the business case to foot in every market, every place, every way. But we believe that's the direction. Now, you asked about EV chargers, so you can imagine EV chargers outside. And it'll be a little different for different types of customers, but for the customers that intend to, own and manage those assets within the sort of the extended building, and that means, paying for the charging on those assets, they're going to want to make sure that they manage those assets, in a cohesive way as a distributed energy resource to make sure that they know what it's costing them to allow the charging outside at different points, and then treat those assets also as a resource to potentially manage within the customer's tariff or within various grid services programs. And so, our view is that, we see an expansion of the number of assets within the buildings, and, that's what a technology platform does. It's another way to say, give you permission to do other things over time. And the other things over time, we believe, are going to extend from the assets of today to the assets of tomorrow, energy storage and EV chargers, and be able to control and manage those for customers, but also treat those as resources that can also be leveraged for demand reduction in this electrification and energy transition journey for the grid.
Other
And
perspectives?
potentially, to say one more point, is also, this technology has a fantastic business case on its own, but, if you're trying to deliver additional technology, this is a way to potentially increase that business case and potentially even subsidize the deployment of additional assets through the benefits that come with this market participation.
Such as?
All the programs we're talking about have a financial benefit to the end customer. And so if the customer can decide what to do with those benefits. Does the customer bank those on the P&L, or do they use it to deploy other assets that might give them greater benefit down the line, or use those financial benefits to deploy other technology or fund other initiatives within the building? That's a decision that each customer will make differently. But one option is to use those financial benefits to deploy other electrification technology, and there's benefits that come with each one of those. Hope that helps.
Nodding, Christie. So you want to jump in with some additional thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree there. From an operational perspective, what this could look like is, there's a fleet of electric vehicles on a site, and it may mean that the charging activity is actually disrupted. You stop using energy to charge up a bunch of Teslas at times that the grid actually needs an extra resource, or it may mean actually discharging the power that's stored in a battery to provide needed energy to the grid or a building or another device. So yeah, it really kind of changes, the one directional nature of energy flow. We think of, there's power plants and that just flows to consumers, and we start to have a much more interconnected dynamic. These electric vehicles can provide what's known as V2X capabilities, allowing a multi-directional flow of energy, which is pretty exciting. And as you're able to actually capture that value, like Mark's saying, you can do a number of different things from a financial perspective, and it has a huge environmental advantage as well.
So EVs are, in this sense, big batteries. What about big batteries? How does that play a role? Any thoughts on that, Dave? Energy storage?
Yeah, battery and storage technology is one of the holy grails to this industry that we're all waiting to see when we can hit the sweet spot. Again, I talked earlier, we've all done, a lot of large commercial enterprises have done the energy efficiency. We all have our different renewable energy strategies and approaches there. And especially if you want to go down the path of like a net zero strategy, you can deploy as much solar as you want, but how do you store it to use it during those off hours, those off cycles here? So it's an incredible technology that there's so much competing industry demand out for batteries, be it on the EV side, be it in commercial battery storage technology, that I still think it's got a little bit of ways to go until the economics will really hit the sweet spot for it to really explode for commercial enterprises. But I fully embrace the technology. In a prior life, I happened to be very fortunate to do one of the first rollouts with a commercial battery provider out there. So I fully respect and see the value of it. And we saw the benefits directly. As an industry, though, it's just taking some time to really get to scale and get everything put into place that people can harvest all capabilities. And especially if you want to take it down to Walgreens. Again, I was fortunate to do some of those projects back there. Not all technologies are built the same for different types of buildings. So I've gone from managing 100,000 to 200,000 square foot centers to 40 to 50,000, and now I'm down to the 10 to 15,000 square foot centers. Our peak demand, average peak demand across the Walgreens is about 60 to 70 kW. Well, the majority of technologies out there, be it distributed generation, be it battery technology, are 100K plus. So right now they're over-designed outside of some select companies out there for me to even pursue them at the 9,000 stores that I have, let alone do the economics work out. So fully embrace the technology. And I'm hoping soon as an industry and society, we can hit the sweet spot. But I think it's got a few headwinds in its place right now.
Yeah, great comment, Dave. And I would say, my view is that ultimately the industry is going to get there. The technology of the battery themselves is going to get there. And so I think it's a matter of time. And if you believe that it's ultimately going to go there, and you believe the cost of energy and the cost of some of this peak demand and the cost of carbon intensive periods of times is going to increase, and you believe in this electrification trend, then I think the thing that I talk to customers about is make sure that you're thinking about it into the future, and you have a technology partner that's planning to go there for you when it pencils, and to do so in an integrated way with all the assets that you've got today, in addition to those of tomorrow. Because I personally believe it's gonna get there, and we believe that, and so we want to help our customers get ready for that when the time comes, and make it an upgrade.
Yeah, Heather, I quickly want to build on that because I know we're running out of time here. That to me is why it's so critical that people think of whether you're a single site, whether you're 10 sites, 100 or 1,000, whatever size. I'm very passionate that putting in smart technologies and a smart controller into your building is so critical because it sets a stage for you to pursue all of those other opportunities. Because what's very important, somebody asked the question here in the thread, what are some of the other headwinds? You got to prove your worth. Whether you did a lighting retrofit, whether you did this or that, or a demand response, or you deployed EVs, the ability to measure and monitor and report back to whatever your stakeholder groups are is so critically important, because that helps you build credibility that you delivered on your commitments, and look at the positive benefits, however you measure them, that were delivered across your leadership group, your stakeholder groups, and it just adds fuel to the fire. So I think that technology is foundational for all the innovative things we still have in our future.
Right. And yeah, we are running out of time, but I want to ask, this builds kind of on what you just mentioned, which is we're not just talking in one building, we're talking building to building, like people have more than one building that they're managing. There is a question here about what role do you see peer-to-peer, like sort of these programs working across buildings, right? Peer-to-peer trading of energy or peer-to-peer management of energy, with all of the actors benefiting from this. Any thoughts on how that plays a role in managing a fleet of buildings, if you will?
Well, I'll take a very one-dimensional stab at that. It gets very tricky if we focus on trading energy between buildings, and especially between organizations. It gets very sticky very quickly, because you're technically a reseller of electricity at that point, and you enter yourself into a whole host of regulatory environments, things such as that. So I think it's a fascinating concept. I've talked with others out in the industry about it a few times over the years, but there are some serious considerations you have to put into play before you can pursue that.
Thanks. So I think we have time for just one sort of wrap up question. So I'm going to go back to like the point of this conference, which is electrification of everything. So putting this back into the foundation, what does this all have to do with building an electrification strategy? How does this act of connecting the buildings get you closer to doing that. Mark, you're off microphone or off mute, so I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, I think that it's a great question because it's the macro question. And I think that the truth is we can't make this electrification transition. We can't make the energy transition on the utility side without virtual power and tackling buildings. And I would almost answer the question with a question back to the group to say, like, do you think the energy transition is gonna continue to accelerate if we have nonstop energy shortages and outages and problems? And I think we know the answer is going to be no. There will be calls to pump the brakes on the energy transition. So I think we have to, think about this. We have to be smart about this. We have to work together. We have to think about the buildings as a resource and engage the end customer, the commercial buildings, as part of the transition, not just residential, not just industrial, but commercial buildings. And that's, an important part of this transition. And what I'm trying to say is that there's a sequence to all this and that buildings are an essential ingredient into this entire transition.
Christie.
Yeah, I think Mark wrapped it up really nicely. Just embracing that full potential of demand side flexibility will just help us meet the needs of electrifying everything. And smart building technologies is really supporting electrification by making the grid more flexible and dynamic. And as these distributed energy resources of all different types, batteries, EV, charging stations, et cetera, as they proliferate, they can take on a more active role in ensuring that the electricity supply and demand remain in balance on the grid.
Mm-hmm. Dave, you get the final word.
Oh, you had me follow those. So yeah, I agree with everything that they said. We are headed for a much more electrified future. Be it, again, we've talked EVs many times, but you think about the world where, hey, now we're starting to consider like natural gas stoves, and let's pivot those with new construction. And so that's coming in our future, and laying the foundation here with how we intelligently deploy this and measure and monitor and optimize it is going to be so critical, so that we don't overbuild capacity on this side and create the same size of problem over here that we're trying to get away from. So we are fully in. I've loved this business that, we all working together because we got to do what's right for what's happening across the planet right now.
Great. Well, I think I need to let you all go. Thank you so much for your time, Christie, Mark, and Dave. And of course, to you in the audience for great questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but they were terrific. And we really appreciate your engagement throughout the session. So go forth and have more fun here at the sessions at Verge Electrify. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks all.